This is the Powered Up Podcast, show 107.
Right. I mean, it's one of those things where there's a depressing reality is for teachers, and that is that the learners get to choose what they learn. Full stop. If they don't want to learn, they will not.
Welcome to a real-world education with insight and advice from teachers in the game, where current and former educators reveal what truly sets apart the great teachers and what it takes to make a positive impact on students. Whether you're in pre-service learning, new to the game, or a seasoned veteran, this is the show for you. You'll leave feeling inspired to take action because we are powering education by empowering you.
Hey, what's going on, everyone? This is Ken Erman, host of the Powered Up Podcast, and I am here with my co-host, Mr. Matt, the master of motivation Rogers. Matt, tonight's episode was a pleasant surprise. It was a blast and way different than any episode we've had.
I mean, it didn't circulate around, grading papers and, the challenges of teaching, but instead, the thought process behind it. So our episode tonight with Don Berg, who's a psychologist who
wealth of knowledge.
Unbelievable. But it was the validation of what we as hopefully good educators or striving to be good educators know, but don't often, see or hear right in front of you. It goes back to those pedagogy classes that I felt like I had in like sophomore year of college, being like, oh, this is what the root of education. But a super interesting episode and a super interesting and impressive member to the field of education.
Yeah, what I appreciated about it is, one, we really dove right into motivation, which obviously is a core component to a successful classroom, having motivated students. And he dispels some false information around motivation, but also offers clear ideas of how to build motivation. And it's honestly, you can set your classroom up to facilitate that environment to thrive. And what I also appreciated about it is, like you said, he was a psychologist. Other than a little bit of like a homeschooling program that he did that we talked about in the beginning, he doesn't have teaching experience. He doesn't have quote unquote K-12 classroom teaching experience, but he gets it. Like he gets teachers, he gets the classroom, he gets how his science and his understanding of how psychology works fits into the classroom versus trying to fit the classroom into the science. You know what I mean? He clearly understands how his piece fits into the reality of school. And I think that's why it was so valuable, because of that perspective that he can offer. So honestly, if it's okay with you, I want to jump right in because it was a really rich conversation, and I just don't want to take any more time. I want to jump right into that conversation. So let's check in with our Teach Better Network and then hear from psychologist Don Berg.
This podcast is a proud member of the Teach Better Podcast Network. Better today, better tomorrow, and the podcast to get you there. You can find out more at teachbetter.com/podcasts. Now let's get back to the episode.
Hi, Don. Welcome to the Powered Up Podcast. How you doing tonight?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, for sure. I'm excited to jump into this conversation. So kick things off nice and simple for us. Officially introduce yourself to our audience. Let us know where you are coming from, and give us a snapshot of your career in and related to education.
Okay. Well, I am currently in West Linn, Oregon, just south of Portland. And my education journey, I grew up in public schools. That's totally where I went until I went off to a private college. Actually, that's what brought me to Oregon from California, was college. So, but I actually dropped out after 3 years. Because I was just kind of on those rails. I got into the college prep program and and the next thing was just college. That was just what was going to happen. And I realized after 3 years in college that wasn't really where my passion was. I didn't really understand why I was there or what I was doing. So I dropped out. But I found that I had a passion for working with children, and actually ended up homeschooling other people's kids for about 5 years in the late 90s. And that sort of altered my understanding of what school could be. And from there, I ended up eventually I started and crashed the business a few times, and then in the 2000 after the 2008 financial kind of challenge, found myself at loose ends and went back to school and actually finished the degree I started in psychology. So I have a degree in psychology, and I realized I wasn't done with education as a field. So what I've been doing since 2012, when I got the degree, was um, focused on how to get the psychology. Self-determination theory is the particular area I work on, and it's the best model for motivation and engagement. And so I realized that part of what had me at loose ends in college when I arrived there was that my K-12 education had not really cultivated my passions and my motivation, my engagement. I knew how to jump through the hoops. I knew how to get the grade, but I wasn't really following a passion and an interest that was um, true to me. And so I've been on this quest for the last 10 years or so to try and how to help educators better understand where the psychology is actually at. Um, one example is that ASCD, very mainstream publication for educators, couple about a year ago, I guess, had a whole issue on motivation and engagement. And I was like, okay, cool. I get the issue and started looking through it and looking for, okay, great. Are they up to date on the science? And it's like they mentioned a certain model of engagement over and over again. But there was an addition to the model 10 years ago that nobody in the education publication even mentioned. Not to mention the fact that one of the articles was actually presenting something that was in the research, but like the researcher had said, this is just intuitions by teachers. It's not meant to be a model of engagement. And they were the ASCD columnists were presenting it as if it was. And so that's just an example of how disconnected sometimes psychology and education are. And I think that the understanding the motivation and engagement will really be something that teachers can benefit from greatly, because every teacher knows that the best kids are the ones who are motivated. And so it's not, what I'm presenting is not a substitute for instructional skill and knowledge, but it is that piece that's a foundational piece to actually enabling the learning to happen at the levels that we recognize and want.
Right. That makes sense. So I really do want to jump into the science and the psychology of that, because it's something that I would not be able to speak to in my knowledge level of the research and understanding of that. Real quick, I would just love to circle back to when you were talking about doing homeschooling and tutoring in the late and mid to late 90s. What would you change about your approach to tutoring if you could go back with your knowledge now? One thing that you would change in the way you tutored students, which is in some capacities very different than teaching in a classroom, but at the same time, it's you're teaching a student a concept. So what is one thing you would do different in a 1 hour tutor session now?
So I didn't tutor.
Okay.
I wasn't tutoring. What I was doing was I was running a consensus run small group out of my home, where the kids would come and we would select every day. I would ask them literally, what do you want to do today? And so we would go out and, usually on public, always on public transportation, and go out and find out because I was living in Portland at the time. But we would go out and do the museums and the parks and the libraries and the, whatever was available as a public resource. That was mainly what they were learning from. Now I had one student who had the reason he was with me was because his mother, who worked for one of the local school districts as an assessment specialist, had brought him to me because he had such a traumatic first grade year, that she was just like, don't bother teaching him to read. Don't worry about anything. Just do your thing. But within a few months, he actually asked me to specifically to teach him to read, and so I mentioned that to her. She provided a nice little graded set of books, and so the deal I made with him, and this is one of the fundamental things about it, was you pick whatever you want to read, any one of those books. We'll work on it for as long as you want to work on it, and then we'll be done for the day and we'll go on. So I mean, we had to do that by 10 a.m. because usually by 10 a.m. we were off taking a bus somewhere else. So we worked on that for months, every day, most days. After a few weeks, we'd forget one day and then have to go back and do it. But his mother actually ended up asking us, reporting back to me. I worked with him for about a year solid, and then they moved to a different county, so they couldn't continue with me anymore. But she said he made a minimum of 2 years progress in every measurable category. And she's an assessment specialist for a district, so she had all the available things. And she said he made as much as 4 years progress in the social categories. So to your question, though, what would I change? One of the things I would change is that, like, now there's a bigger opportunity for outreach. Just like I didn't have, the internet wasn't a thing for me, or it certainly wasn't a big thing. And so, just from a business standpoint, that was going to make a big difference. But I would actually probably be more careful about having resources, subject specific resources. Like his mother had provided a set of books, so I'd have some resources. I'd be more careful about sort of the basic academic subjects and things that in instructing those more particularly, just because that was something I was being more intuitive about how I was approaching things, and I'd be a little more deliberate today.
Oh my! So I've been pulling up things that I would love to reference, and I think Ken, I don't know if you're welcome to ask another question before I jump into what I think we will spend a lot of time.
Let's jump right in. I'm really interested.
So I literally got an invitation for a training, and I thought it was interesting in your explanation that you referenced dropping out of school, that you referenced that you knew how to do school and could play by the rules of school, but that and I use the term all the time, intrinsic motivation is, the gateway to real learning. And there's some truth to that, but I also put a lot of eggs into that basket. And I was pulling up this training I'm doing, and the training is called Who is Talking? And the opening line that I found interesting is, it says, think about this. Correct answers can mask confusion, just as incorrect answers can hide understanding. And that is the opening line in a description for a training. And I think classically, Ken, I don't want to speak for you, nor do I want to speak for all public ed teachers, but when I look at how I budget my time, I naturally try to work towards the middle, differentiating in each direction for extension opportunities and providing support for the kids that I expect to have challenges. And sometimes I give myself a lot of credit in formative assessment, watching body language and, listening to different questions. That's as much as I can give on a daily basis. With that being said, a kid just happened to get a multiple choice question right, and we've all heard it, oh, I guessed on that answer, is one of the most damaging and devastating features of education as a teacher, because you're associating your instruction leading to the success, and they just took a roll of the dice. So not that leads into a question necessarily, but one of the beautiful things about what you're saying is this is a huge component of education where I almost don't want to give time to it because I can't handle, creating time for the unpacking of what that could possibly look like.
Right, right. I mean, it's one of those things where there's a depressing reality is for teachers, and that is that the learners get to choose what they learn. Full stop. If they don't want to learn, they will not. And that is kind of that's just being real. And so the challenge around motivation in particular is one, there's a misconception that you can motivate somebody else. You can't. They have built-in motivations that you can encourage, you can cultivate, you can create an environment that allows them to pursue and to follow that in some manner, but you don't do any motivating. And so that's a big challenge. That's the reality that the psychologists are basically saying, look, that's not really, when you say we're going to, give a motivational speech or you're going to motivate someone, it's like, it may look like that, it may feel like that at times, but that's not what's really going on. And so that's where, the motivation piece is really built on three, and this is straight from the self-determination theory, is built on three key components, and that is the primary human needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And so, and those are all perceptions, not circumstances. So when you're trying to help enable them to follow their motivations, to figure out, and when you want to cultivate their intrinsic motivation, their interests, part of what you have to do is, and the first thing to do is build a relationship, build relatedness. Now, all your teachers know that. Like that's not news. But it is important to understand that the part of those other two components, autonomy and competence, and competence as a perception, not you don't observe their competence. Your observation of their competence is not what we're talking about. It's their perception of their competence. And so that's where, when you get into differentiation, partly what you're trying to do there is make sure that the challenge you present them with matches the skill level that they have, or it stretches the skill level that they have ideally. It's not just matching it, but actually pushing it a little bit further so that they build skill. But that's the trick of differentiation. It's like every one of those kids is probably at a different place. And so how do you do that? And then the autonomy piece is, particularly in the American context, is like, it's all about giving them some kind of choice. Now, the choice thing is, it actually isn't technically about choice. It's about, they will take whatever you give them if you're someone they trust. If they don't trust you, it doesn't matter what you give them. They may not buy in. Now, they may just happen to be interested in that and take it, but if they don't trust you, then you're at a disadvantage. And that's why I always say start with trust. Start with relationship building, the relatedness piece, because that's going to be the foundation that allows you to become the person who can throw out an idea and they'll say, yeah, okay, great. I trust you. Let's do it. You're not always, perfect. You're not always going to get it right, but that part of what you need to build that trust is so that they are willing to take the chance. Okay, let's try that.
So what's so interesting is I'm reading a book right now. It's called So Good They Can't Ignore You. I want to say Cal Newport, but that could be completely wrong on the author. But So Good They Can't Ignore You. It's a very good book. And I'm only about a third of the way through. And I recently just read about these three key components of motivation, exactly as you just described. And it hit me. The book has nothing to do with teaching. It's about, my own personal growth, right? And when I read that, I said, wow, this connects exactly to teaching. And when I so I'm not in the classroom anymore. I work as an instructional coach, so I'm supporting teachers more. And I'm doing a lot of consulting and working with other school districts right now as well. In my classroom, when I taught fifth grade, student-centered learning was the key ingredient. And Matt probably caught me grinning ear to ear when you were talking about the autonomy piece. And when I read that, it further solidified the things that I was doing in my classroom that I'm encouraging teachers to do about the idea of using small group instruction is because you can increase the relationships you have with students. You can increase the ability for them to feel competent and to build their competency. And that autonomy piece is there as well. It gives them choice. And what I really found interesting was how you clarified the difference between our recognized competency and the student's competency. And I'll be perfectly honest, usually when I'm presenting with teachers, whether as a keynote presenter or running a workshop, I tell them pretty much everything I say is based off of zero research. It's based off of pure experience and observations. And one thing that I did in my classroom when I was doing something where they were assessing, whether they were being assessed to see where they were in the scheme of a unit or a skill, if it was not a pretest, which they would typically do poorly on, if it was a mid-unit check towards the end of the unit, I always had the data present to them when they finished so that they could see how they scored on this quick check to see if they knew how to add and subtract fractions and mixed numbers, right? Something as basic of a skill that. And I always said, I wanted my students to understand the data. I wanted them to understand what the data looked like, how I was using that to then impact instruction later that day or the following day. And so I kind of feel like that is feeding right into this idea of their own perceived competency, because they knew, hey, wow, I got a 7 out of 8. I'm competent at this. So now they're more, I just said, well, they're becoming more confident. Or I got a 2 out of 8. I can't wait for Mr. Ehrman to help me so that I can get a 7 out of 8 tomorrow. So I don't know if that feeds into that trust thing, but I would just love you to dive more into what true autonomy looks like, the relatedness you can hit on as well, but I think that's something teachers would be a little bit more familiar with. And then again, that competency piece, how do we make students feel as though they are in an autonomous classroom, and how do we get students to feel that they are competent in what they're doing in a classroom?
Right. Yeah. So the autonomy piece is big. There's a ton of research on it, and specifically in education, where there's autonomy research in a variety of fields, but education in particular has been really big. And so they're finding that there's kind of two ways to look at the autonomy piece. Not only, what I mentioned, the students' perception of autonomy, but there's also some very key ways that teachers trying to support or provide autonomy is you end up with what they call motivating style. And so that's a key component as well, is understanding those motivating styles is crucial so that you're understanding, okay, what am I doing the thing that will have that impact that you're looking for? Is my and essentially it comes down to it's a 4-part model, but the key thing is that there's autonomous and there's controlled. And so if you're doing the controlling, if you're telling them what to do all the time and you're not explaining why things are going on, like you gave the example of having a quiz, an assessment where they can say, oh, this is where I'm at, can I get better? That's giving them a lot of information, something they can work with and say, okay, what can I aim for? How can I get the help that I need? And you talk about the learner centered, is that a lot of what's called learner centered is often about how do we help kids have that some form of autonomy, have strong relationships, such that, because the teacher's not the only one they have to have a good relationship with. There's a lot of other people in the room who could destroy their opportunities to learn through their behavior. So interacting being untrustworthy as a classmate can also diminish the learning. There's some really interesting research on how just having one person in an environment, in a classroom, who is disruptive diminishes learning for everyone. And so that's a really important dynamic, is it's not just me and each kid, it's me and us. Who are we as a class together, and how are we operating together? So that autonomy piece is really crucial. And it is interesting, that there was this great research done in Hong Kong, because they were responding to this piece of research done in Stanford, and there was a bunch of Asian American kids who responded differently than everybody else. And so they speculated that autonomy might not be a primary need for them. So these researchers in Hong Kong said, okay, well, let's test it more directly. And they found that the kids, they were given a puzzle, and then, of course, if they chose it themselves, that was maximum autonomy. If the ones they trusted the least were their classmates. But they also told them that it was chosen by their teacher or their mother, and there was a direct relationship between the quality of the relationship with that other, either the teacher or the mother. The better the relationship, the more trust they have with that, then the more autonomy they felt. And so that's a crucial piece to building on that. Is you do have to build those trusting relationships. Teachers usually really good at that. But then you have to also look at what opportunities do you have for building on that autonomy, to have them have a sense. And choice is a big piece in the American context, especially. In China, they trust their teachers more than they do here. But that's one of those things where, okay, where can you build on that? Where can you what choices are meaningful to each kid? That's another piece that's important. Is just because you give a choice doesn't mean it's going to support autonomy. It has to be a choice that's meaningful to that kid. And actually, it turns out that meaningfulness was studied. They thought maybe meaningfulness was another primary need. Well, it turns out that meaningfulness is just a byproduct of meeting the needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness, and beneficence, actually, which is a secondary need. So nothing bad happens if you don't have it, but it only produces good things if you do. Whereas with all the three that are primary needs, if you are thwarting those needs, then well-being goes down. Well-being is diminished. So that's a distinction. But those meaningfulness is a byproduct of autonomy, competence, relatedness, and beneficence. So if you're really building on it and understanding that competence is a perception, not a circumstance, is a clue as to how to approach it. Is okay. As you're going through you're providing challenges to them, to their competence, is being really attentive to what's working and what isn't, being really attuned to when they're either overwhelmed or bored, and figuring out, okay, how can we optimize that? And one of the things that I suggested a lot of times is the more that the kids are self-regulating in that regard, because they're better judges of that. So if you give them a range of things and then they can figure out where their challenge level is, that's going to be more efficient and more effective for everybody.
Can I just, one of the things I'm held up on is, I'm judging myself from even today, how things went. So we're recording this during mid-year testing, and mid-year testing for us has a lot of value that is debatable when considering what is the testing source and what is it being used for. And one of the challenges that I'm struggling with just listening to you, reflecting literally what happened in my classroom 4 hours ago, is I'm sitting there pitching to my kids that they are going to take a series of different assessments that really don't matter, but they kind of do matter. They don't matter to me. And obviously I'm not saying it in that same way. But it's kind of in their best interest to try their best to represent their actual academic ability. So I'm listening to the first few minutes of this podcast saying, oh my goodness, when it comes to the autonomy and these features of teaching in a way that I'm proud in public education and in education in general, I also have these roadblocks that, there's nothing that I can get around. And I end up having to be the biggest cheerleader for something that I struggle to justify. And so I guess my question really comes down to is how do we handle that moral dilemma in education where we say, I'm sitting there saying to my kids, I'll use a scenario real quick. I had one student who happens to have an IEP. He's ES as labeled, but I think it's kind of an interesting label. I think that he struggled to connect to a teacher that held him firm in certain areas that became non-negotiables. But that's besides the point. Whenever it comes to an assessment, he's like, I'm not going to give any effort whatsoever. And literally, beginning of this school year, we did one of our assessments on a tablet, and he rapid tapped. I mean, he couldn't have cared less if he was spelling his own name with the answers. And the follow-up of that is, he's getting pulled for an academic group that's, lowest tier possible. And he then perpetuates classroom challenges. And I've been fortunate enough to develop a relationship. And I just said, hey, but it's kind of in your best interest, because I know when we're talking that that's not your performance. It would be really in your best interest for at least this assessment to just really try, and next assessment, just really try. Those two things will resort you. I really have little say. I want to bump you up, but you're not giving me the proof behind that. All that to say, I give that prep talk, and he's in the same group as he was, but he definitely tried harder. And the second month when he did it, he went from the most intensive group to naturally the highest group. And all it really took was, 5 minutes of concentrated effort with enough data points to prove, he's really capable. That is a beautiful picture of, try where you have to. Let's get back to how the classroom usually runs. But I'm sitting in front of kids literally today that I'm not pulling to the side saying, hey, we're going to compare what you did beginning, middle, and end of the year in second grade and third grade and your projections for fourth grade. It doesn't affect your grade at all. And I'm not really honestly going to do a whole lot with this data besides show your parents because I have to. That I feel like I'm struggling with my integrity as a teacher, knowing that I have to incorporate this part of things, which feels like when talking about, autonomy, when talking about, relatedness, I am, cutting myself off at the feet, harming the trust and, support that I've worked so hard to develop.
Right. And that's one of the key things that I mean, I would be worried if you weren't concerned about that. Like not recognizing that that's an issue and that that's a challenge would be alarming. The fact that you recognize it is really good, because the truth is that the motivation and engagement is contagious. Is like if you're not really showing up and being there for them, even in the midst of the struggle of what is required of you, then there's a bigger challenge. There's a bigger issue. But that's where you recognize, okay, what can I do? And you need to be, thinking about your own autonomy, competence, and relatedness, and saying, what do I need to be able to support my needs? In order to support their needs, in order to be the nurturer that a teacher usually aspires to being, means you have to, you have to have the resource to provide it. And that's where, looking up the chain of command is also helpful, is if your leaders understand about autonomy, competence, and relatedness, that would really help. And in my experience, that's not usually true. So then that is the very crux of the issue. And there's actually some really good research, interesting research, looking at what they call moral injury in teaching, is that being in that contradiction of having to support systems that you don't necessarily believe in is actually a really big challenge. And so so one thing that I'm working on is actually a prototype of think of it as a formative assessment for motivation. Is that it's actually a teacher-centric, classroom. I call it instant climate. So if you could go in and say, okay, how's everybody doing on autonomy, competence, and relatedness, and how am I doing in supporting your autonomy, competence, and relatedness, immediately get feedback on that, like within a day, and then be able to take another measure in a couple of weeks and see how you've done. That's what I'm working on. There's nothing like that out there that I've found yet. So so that's one thing that a piece that I think is really important is, just as you need that formative assessment, just having one test at the end of the year isn't really helpful. In climate, you should be having the same kind of opportunity, is saying, okay, how are my kids doing? How am I doing in supporting them? And then you can start to, not in an academic sense, but in that climate sense, say, okay, do I need to be focused on autonomy or competence or relatedness? And then you can actually get an assessment of that. So that's a piece I'm working on right now. Should be available shortly, like within a few weeks, I think. And just to address that very issue is, like, as you start to use that, you're not only yourself, but your kids will keep seeing these questions and think, oh, that's kind of important. And you can start to build on that as a skill as well, just like you do with your other, the academic skills. It's something you can then build that muscle moving forward.
One of the things that I'd love to just get your feedback, following up on that is, kind of like the on your website, you call your experience in education. I might be a recovering faux achiever. Yeah. Sorry. And I love that term. I don't know why I read it Fox. I know that it's not said that way, but much like us going through a traditional educational system, we learn how to do school. And I think the same thing for teachers. We take that learn how to do school. We obviously did it pretty well to get to the positions we're in, and so we apply a lot of those aspects. And I think that there's a ton of teacher advocacy, but, really, and I'd love feedback if you have it. We talk about burnout related to teaching, and burnout is often when frustration of the education system and your educational philosophy do not match. Or, there are other factors, not a good school and working environment, the kids, not being a good balance, grade level, all of those features. But, I think that there's a component of when you feel like what you're having to do is against your moral judgment of what you thought education would be, is a huge component of the challenge of education. Putting that out there, a portion of that, I love the moral injury concept, is post that 5-year burnout, we'll use that effort, a lot of us end up swallowing that down and accepting that as a part of education. So I guess my 2 parts that I would love you to kind of, obviously anything that I said, please tap into. But the first part really comes into, how do we continue to stay fresh in the mindset of, kind of the methods that you're sharing, and not succumb to what almost becomes nature to us. And I think that's a big portion, because you bringing it up to my head, I'm like, oh my gosh, these are my morals. This is why I'm doing it. As I watch my kids, all right, everyone sit quietly for, those type features earlier today. And the other component that I would love to kind of hear from, and maybe I'll ask for this follow-up, is, how do you think that this has been improved post-pandemic compared to pre-pandemic? Because at least I'll just share, Ken, and you can kind of speak to this as well. I feel like the dam broke a little bit when it came to standardized testing within my school district, because there was no way that the same emphasis could still be there when the emphasis had to be caring about kids. And it made it possible, at least in my classroom, in my building, in my district, potentially in my state of what I see, whether it's the movement of SEL, whatever you want to frame it as, it has become so much more welcome to, for one PD day a year, we really care about data and we check up on data, but it's not we're looking at our scores compared to our colleagues, to the schools next to us, to the state average, those type features. I know that's a whole lot, but I'll kind of turn it over to you.
Actually, it's really great that you asked that, because there's if you've heard of Todd Rose, he's author of The End of Average, did a TED Talk and stuff like that. But anyway, his latest book is called Collective Illusions. And he just issued a report from he has a think tank called Populist, where they do research, and it was on education. And it's specifically about this. What a collective illusion is we each think, like in education, we each think a bunch of things, like, okay, but we also project and think, well, but society believes something else. So for instance, standardized tests is like, there's this notion that our society demands accountability via standardized tests. But if you look at how people actually think, everyone agrees personally that standardized tests are not a high priority. They're a very low priority. There's a lot. They actually, the way this research was done, a key piece of it was 57 items that are things like, accountability via standardized tests, but also things like kids should follow their passion or their curiosity or have more choices, or a bunch of things, a bunch of different values basically in education. Standardized tests is a negative, on the negative side. It's like it's always in the bottom. There's a lot of other things that are higher priority, and that's true of when they break out parents or they break out racial groups, or every way they break it down. Standardized tests, nobody agrees in their hearts that it's a high priority. But that's the one that has the highest discrepancy between how we believe it is and what you think society believes it is. And that's called a collective illusion, because the vast majority of people believe that standardized tests aren't very good at anything, aren't very good for the school system. But everybody also believes society as a whole somehow believes that. And it's not true. But so that's a collective illusion. And so it's really, there has been somewhat of a change in the way that those educational values. They've actually been collecting that data. This is the first time I've heard of it. But apparently they have 4 years of data already. And so they were collecting data right through the pandemic. And some of those things really did slip in terms of like, oh, well, let's reorder things because things are different now. And I think a lot of it has to do with parents being exposed to sort of like, oh, some of the, the leaves have fallen from their eyes kind of thing. Like, this is not the way we thought it was, and in some good ways. So I think that I think there's an opening there. I'm not sure that the situation as a whole has truly improved, because unfortunately we have all these mechanisms in various laws and policies that were based on those illusions. They were based on the idea of accountability and a whole bunch of things that we know, that we as teachers, we as experts in the field, kind of know that's not good for kids. And the thing is that we all actually do know it in our profession. Even parents have caught onto a lot of it, and so I think we as professionals need to be a little more forward about, no, this is what's good for kids. We know this, and standardized tests is not one of them. We need to go ahead and recognize, and trying to remember what the report was called. But anyway, if his think tank Populist, if you look up their education report, I'm sure you'll find it. But I think we need to really pay attention to that information and look at, oh, okay, there's a whole bunch of things that we can organize our educational politics around that literally everyone agrees on, even though there's the kind of SELCRT bizarre things, but that's actually a marginal conversation in terms of the number of people who are really engaged with it. The real big conversation is that actually across the political spectrum, we want education to be practical. We're no longer under the illusion that college should be everybody's destination. That's one of the revelations from this as well. It's like, oh, I'm so glad to know that I'm not crazy. I'm not the only one thinking that. So I think that is really important for us to recognize that difference between a collective illusion and the places where we actually have consensus. And I think that learner-centered stuff is something most of it is, everybody agrees with it. It's just a matter of like, okay, how do we, navigate these policies and these laws that still have some leftover baggage from when, people were operating under the collective illusion. And I think that's where there's, a little bit more of an opening is uh, opening up that idea that in fact education is about nurturing children. Now, I wouldn't use that language just, anywhere in the general public, but because there's a confusion about what nurturing means. And so there's parents who are concerned that, oh, you're, supplanting the home as the source of nurturing. Well, no, but you're misunderstanding how education works if you think that a teacher cannot nurture and teach effectively. Those don't go together. The children have to be nurtured in order to learn. So it's not about supplanting, doing something more than the house. The family in the home is still a central location for kids learning. It's not going to change. But the teachers also have to be focused on relatedness, focused on competence and autonomy, and that looks certain ways, and that has to be done in order for the learning to happen. So one of the things, my new book is called Schooling for Holistic Equity, and one of the things in it is I present something called Back to Basics 2.0. So Back to Basics 1.0 was sort of 3 R's, strict obedience, and no nonsense in the classroom, which meant mainly no social services, and because they viewed that as extras. So that actually could work as long as Back to Basics 2.0, which really has to do with supporting needs, is in place. Those aren't inherently bad strategies, but they in the context of a school system where the kids are compelled to be there, and so there's a level of disconnection just because their autonomy is not supported in the fact that they're there, then the teacher actually has to overcome that. And in order to overcome that, they have to do better at supporting needs. So that's where, Back to Basics 2.0 is the way that I say, okay, if we can establish that and then test out whether the Back to Basics 1.0 works, great. But you can't do Back to Basics 1.0 without supporting the human needs. That's just how human beings are wired. So that's where I think that we can look at how things are changing, is that we need to be proactive about how we're directing whatever opportunities for change come up. It needs to be directed more precisely about, okay, let's understand and find a way to build bridges politically, so that everyone understands the children really are, everyone agrees the children have to get a practical education, has to be about getting them into the world in a productive way. And so what does that mean? That's a good question. I don't know. I'm a psychologist. And so that's where I think that there is a way that if we can start to focus on those primary needs, then educators like yourself start to, push that up and get your higher ups to also understand that, then you'll get better support as well.
My head is spinning with questions and ideas, and and Matt and I, we always have a chat that we use just to make sure we're on the same page, and both of our reactions right now are, there's no way we're going to be able to get everything that we want to ask in our typical time of the show. So I think we're already slating you for a repeat visit.
There you go. Yeah.
Because I have things I want to jump in with goal setting and how you facilitate that in the classroom, but I don't want to cut that short. So what sure. I want to do is stay focused on what we're doing here, and you just have to promise that you have to come back with us.
Absolutely.
So when we think about these 3 key pieces, the autonomy is the one that's sticking out to me the most, because relatedness, we've said many times, it's something that teachers need to continue to focus on. It's something that teachers need to make sure they have genuine relationships with their students. And like you said, the student to student, but that's a typical part of teaching. Competency, like that's our goal. But I do appreciate the piece of you saying about it's not us validating that they are competent, is the student perceiving themselves as competent. So I think that was really important. But this idea of autonomy is not in the quote unquote traditional classroom. So what is, let's break them down by age level. So let's just say elementary and secondary. What is a key look for or trait of a classroom in an elementary school? And if you need to break down like first and second versus fourth and fifth, that's fine. But what's one key look for in a classroom that a teacher can point to say, this represents true autonomy for my students, that will feed into this idea of motivation, and not just, like you said, random choices that don't actually create autonomy because they don't care about the choices. So what are those key look fors that we can put into our classroom?
So it's interesting because it's one of those areas where because autonomy relies on a perception and not a circumstance, it contradicts the premise of the question. Is if I can look into a classroom and know exactly, oh, all their autonomy is supported. Like, yeah, that would be so great. Wouldn't that be awesome if you could do that? Well, unfortunately, it's not that simple. So that's why I'm creating the instant climate piece that I mentioned earlier, is that you have to have a way of looking below that surface and say, okay, I give them a lot of choices. But are the choices I'm giving them actually the ones that matter? Is it moving the needle on autonomy to give those choices? Well, you need some way to assess that beyond I'm looking out and they seem happy. Or they're not loud and disruptive, or they're like whatever term you want to use. So that's why an assessment like that is necessary, is to be able to say, okay, I know that I have this intention. I want to make it happen, and I'm going to use choice making. I'm going to like a lot of the things around at the beginning of the year. One of the things you do is you come in and you say, okay, here's how it's going to be. Now, ideally, you're saying, how do we want it to be? Um, you're helping them develop the expectations for the class. What are the rules going to be? How are we going to, there's a whole bunch of things you do right at the beginning. And this is one of the first principles of my Back to Basics 2.0 is you teach governance before you teach academics. Now, everybody already does that, but they're not doing it in a way that really focuses on and says, okay, but we're going to stop the academics and get back to governance every time it breaks down until we're good at doing this governance piece. And then we can proceed, because the governance actually is more fundamental from a order of operations kind of sensibility. Is in mathematics you have to do the what is it, the multiplication before the addition? Is that the way it goes? Anyway, my partner's a mathematician, but not me. So you have to do certain things first. It doesn't mean that those other things are more or less important. The order you do them is just because that's how it works. In mathematics, it's a logical thing, but for human beings, it's like, oh, you have to do these governance piece because that's going to build that foundational foundation. They need to, that's where you're going to be able to figure out and assess, okay, what's working. And one of the things that you should probably be doing is checking in with your students and saying, how can we do better? What's going to be more engaging? What's going to be more interesting? Now, that's why you also have to have an assessment, because no matter what language you use, they're not thinking the same way we are, and you're not as teachers thinking the way I am as a psychologist. So you have to have some kind of assessment that actually asks the questions in the validated way, and then say, oh, okay, autonomy's not quite there yet. Let's work on something. And then, one of the things is there is actually a list of classroom practices like punishment. Some people think fair punishments are a good idea and that unfair punishments are a really bad idea. Well, it turns out they're both bad ideas. Bad ideas in the sense that they have negative consequences for motivation. Now, you may need to use punishment at some point for some reason. And so you want to do it fairly so that you minimize the motivational damage you're going to do. It doesn't mean don't ever use it. It means use it and do it in a way that actually either minimizes damage or then build structures and you build the classroom expectations such that those things you don't have to resort to punishment. And so that's one of those things where, okay, how do I assess what's going to happen in the classroom? Can I say, oh, here's the key practice? Not really, unfortunately. I can give you a list of things that are probably, that have been very scientifically studied to say, here's the impact these are going to have. Giving kids choices has a generally positive impact. And then you have things like the punishment that always have a negative impact. So there are things, but it's not as simple as I can walk into a classroom and know whether it's working or whether autonomy is being supported here or not. I wish it was that simple, but that's why there's a whole science that actually has to study these things very carefully.
So Can I just kind of question the age component from a little difference? I am stuck on moral injury. I don't know what it is. I'm hyper focused, and I know we have limited time with you, but one of the things that I feel like is as a fourth grade, and Ken, I don't know if you feel the same way. As a fourth grade teacher, I'm at that hovering point of my relationship. Like the kids want to do everything right by me still. And I think that goes well beyond fourth grade. I don't think it's limited to just fourth grade. It just is reflected in different ways, influence of social opportunities, all the different features are there that as you get on, I can make my kids care for that 45 minutes because of what I say, and they buy into it, which almost makes that moral injury harsher at the end of the day, which leads to, again, Ken, who you're working with, being like, it doesn't really matter until you're in high school, where you're like, I need these grades to lead to my next level, if that's a track that you're heading in. So I guess my question for you related to that is, how does that reflect differently, maybe not just moral injury, but when looking at the different tiers and those three components that you're talking about, relatability becomes, I would imagine, heavily necessary in that middle school, early high school, and beyond. Whereas autonomy, is there a limit of like how young and how broad that, I guess, kind of some of those confines of each of those features based off the age of kids that you're working with?
So one of the things about these three needs is that they are not age dependent. Everyone needs them, all ages. Infants need some degree of autonomy. They have very limited access to it because of their obvious limitations. So there's a need. The need is there through the lifespan. Now, there is that kind of what's the developmentally appropriate, kind of way to express it, and that's an important question. And part of what you have to look at is what are the constraints in your environment. Is you are under obligation, like you said, you have to do these assessments. It's not your choice to do them, but it is required. And so part of the strategy there is to creatively look at, okay, one thing that I've done with classes in various guises is take their side against whatever is imposed upon you. Is that always be on their side? Oh yeah, and I think the way you described it with your student was probably along those lines. Is like, hey, I get it, that's out there, but I'm on your side. If you do a little effort here, it'll really help us. And so I think that's another aspect is to be real with the students, even when they're young, even fourth grade, even younger. They get it that there's things that have to be done. They're kids. They get to have to do all things all the time. And so the challenge is really how do you find ways to create opportunities for them to have, to take something on, to be autonomous about something, have, and figuring it out. That's part of where you have to, really build on that relationship and make sure that you're tuning into what are the important things what is important to this student, and is whatever we're trying actually working, and if it's not, change it up. What's going to work? And really being in the conversation with them. It's not going to look like, hey, how's your autonomy today? Because no one does it, talks like that. No one. It doesn't work that way. But finding the language that they have, and this is where some of the cultural sensitivity stuff comes in. It's like, hey, the language might be a little different in some places, and the opportunities might be very different in one cultural context for another. So it is relevant as well to say, okay, what's valued, who is this kid, and how are they valuing, freedoms, or freedom's another language for autonomy, right? It can be, or are they in a cultural context that simply says, autonomy is defined by how you relate to others. That's a more collectivist approach. And so, okay, how do we bring that out? How do we bring that forward in the context we're in? So really paying attention is crucial, and it's going to build on that relationship. But like, one of the things on my I wish I can't remember which video, but I do have these items. Well, it'll be part of the instant climate piece. Is I'll have the listing of the ones, the specific teacher behaviors that have been studied, what their impacts are on motivation, and then specific recommendations on if autonomy needs to be supported, or if you're finding that kids are having their autonomy thwarted. These are not a list of like, okay, here's what exactly to do, but here's the principles, here's some behaviors that have been studied, and then you can start to build an idea of what to do from those.
It's fascinating. It's it's something that we as teachers aren't exposed to enough, even in our training in college. Going through those classes, and also just the professional development piece and just the time piece of all of the things that teachers have to think about. So that's why I think this conversation has been so valuable, and something I definitely want to continue in the future. Mm-hmm. I do want to be cognizant of your time right now, as well as just our show as a whole. So we're going to end with the same segment. It's called the exit ticket. Same 4 questions we ask every guest every week.
All right.
Question number 1. What is the best thing a teacher can do to make a student's school experience better?
Oh, that's easy. That's support their needs. Build that relationship. Really focus in on how they perceive their competence, not just how you're perceiving it, and really finding what is it that jazzes them. Where is their autonomy going to shine in this context? What is it that they're passionate about, they're interested in, and finding ways, even if you have restricted opportunities, what are the ways you can find just even a little bit of their interest and their passion into the classroom experience.
Fantastic. What is the best piece of advice you've received? And it could be from a colleague, supervisor, or even student.
So I would say that this was one I got from a parent, and he said, the measure of the quality of a classroom, he was I can't remember if he said classroom, is the light in the children's eyes. And so you have to really attend to the light in their eyes, and if it's dimming, you need to look deeper, and if it goes out, you need to change things up. And so that I think is a really a nice way to, it really summarizes what self-determination theory is really about. Is if the light's on in their eyes and they're really got that spark of interest, you're good to go. If that's flagging, then figure it out, make it better.
Ken, we've done 106 episodes prior to this, and that is one of the most obvious and relatable answers that we've heard. That I'm going to be looking for that tomorrow. Absolutely. So obviously not directly in the classroom, but you can definitely relate to how the school year goes in waves, times that are easier, and then there are times that are more challenging, that teachers and students are struggling to survive. What is something you feel like every educator needs to hear in those moments to power up through those moments of struggle?
Interesting. I think recognizing that we all have those same fundamental needs is actually really crucial. Is if you're in that flagging moment, then look for where your spark is, where your the light in your eyes is just as important. And what is it that you need to tune into? Find that thing that ignites your passion. What is that thing? And as an adult, we can be a little more circumspect about it and find that thing that, what's that one piece that will light you up every time you look at it? The photograph of your kid, or the, photograph of something, or the person that you can connect to that lights you up every day. If you have that person in your school, so much the better. But yeah, finding that thing that will reignite your flame, even if it's that momentary one, keep an eye out for it.
Very interesting. It's easy to fall into facilitating a repetitive classroom. I've modified this slightly for you. What do you think motivates teachers to be the ones who are constantly seeking to change, innovate, and implement new teaching strategies into their classroom?
Oh, I actually had a problem with my earpiece. Could you say that again?
Yeah, no worries. So I modified this question slightly for you. It's easy to fall into facilitating a repetitive classroom. What do you think motivates the teachers who are the ones who are constantly seeking to change, innovate, and adopt new teaching strategies?
Ah, so I think what you find, well, for a lot of teachers, it's the kids. You know, like the kid, focusing on the kids is gonna be the thing that, like, okay, it's not quite there. Let's shift it. Let's do something more. Um, and I think that is the same is true for yourself as for looking out at the kids. Is, once again, find that thing. What is it that triggers you? What is it that a little bit of frustration can be the thing that inspires you to do something creatively. And tuning into yourself, like, mindfulness is one of the most interesting practices. It may not be for everybody, but it is one that has some really good empirical support behind it. Is tuning in and figuring out, like, if you're in that, if you're at burnout, you might be there. But if you're not yet at burnout, but you're just having a stressful day, um, taking some time to really tune in and quiet yourself, and find what whether it's breathing or meditating or a mantra or something, um, but find that thing to tune in, and then tackle those challenges. And that's, I think, where you'll find the innovation. You'll find that piece that has you go that extra step. Um, is tuning into who you are and how you show up in the world. Is Parker Palmer said it. You are what was it? Anyway, you are what you teach. You are the teaching. I forget how he said it, but really finding that place in yourself where um, the that truly inspired, centered place, and then finding better ways to, consistent ways to access that, and you'll find that motivation. You'll discover the innovation that you need.
I'm sure you would say, much like the kids, you can easily generate a second or third or fourth wind when you're tapping into those passions. So I know we had the chance to kind of view some of your work while waiting for you to join. Can you share the best way for our audience to continue to connect with you going forward?
Yes. So my website is holisticequity.org. I'm, there's lots of resources there. I make a lot of videos. And like I said, the instant climate thing will be coming up there in the next few weeks. And so that's the best way. And I have a newsletter that I put out, 2 to 4 times a month. So not a lot, but that's where you can keep up with me.
And I will say the style of, just attire in some of those videos, the vest is very impressive. The wardrobes you have.
Thanks.
Well, Don, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a blast. It's been something very different than what we've had on the show, and I think very valuable for both Matt and I, as well as our listeners. So thank you again for the information, the perspective, and really the science behind what we can do to, like you said, we can't motivate people, but create an atmosphere in which motivation can thrive. And I think that's an interesting piece where, again, it gets teachers to think about it's not what we do, it's what we create for students to allow them to thrive. And I really appreciate that. So thank you so much for joining us, and for our listeners, thank you for tuning in and staying with us and following us each and every week as we bring amazing guests and educators into our world and open our eyes to what they can offer us in our classroom and to benefit students. So if you have not already, please head over to our website, powereduup.com, become a member there, and you can receive communication and stay up to date with all of the podcasts that we're rolling out each and every week. So Matt, why don't you take us on out of here?
All right. As we power down this episode, we are positive, Don, that you left us feeling powered up. We look forward to part 2, but in the meantime, everyone stay well and make a difference tomorrow.
Thank you so much for listening to this podcast. If you haven't already, please subscribe on whichever platform you're listening to or watching us on YouTube. Each week, we get to talk to amazing educators who are making a positive impact on the lives of students, their colleagues, administrators, and education as a whole. It's been such a privilege every week to be able to talk to these incredible individuals, learn from them, grow with them, and better myself and all of education through these conversations. If you haven't already, please consider sharing this with a colleague, someone who can benefit and be powered up from the experience of listening to these incredible conversations. Because of Powered Up, we are powering education by empowering you.